Right, next talking point then. Well, my first one was the sprint qualifying, and my second one is the Max v Lewis incident, seeing as it is lap one. So I say we get diving into that. We'll cover this. We'll sort of be covering this in two parts, I think, because a lot of the questions that we got in View for the Stands were understandably about that. So we'll probably end up covering this in two little parts, really. So obviously we have a fantastic opening first lap. We have this really brilliant battle between these two. It's what we're dying to see. But it also feels like this incident is coming. They're getting really close. Hamilton is actually doing a little bit of yielding in places in order to avoid problems, and also to sort of stay out of dirty air, get good traction going to the corners. They have this brilliant battle. There's no DRS. It's all just straight up racing. And we end up with this huge impact. Max is obviously pretty winded. 51G, I think Christian Horner said maybe 9, 10 or 11 times to everyone, just to make sure everyone knew that. Fortunately, Max was okay. He did step out the car. Obviously, he had to do a few procedural checks, but fortunately, he was okay. It was a big, big hit. The halo did its job once again. We can see the red paint on the side of that halo. It clearly showed that it avoids like the tyre hitting him, avoid the barrier hitting him in any way that's nasty. So it's incredible that drivers can get out of the car after an accident like that. It really is very, very impressive and indicative of the safety improvements that have been made. So that's good. That's the best news that comes out of all of this. Obviously, this was always going to produce a lot of very strong emotions because it's the two championship contenders and it's at the British Grand Prix and it's resulted in a very big impact. So with that said, let's try and take a deep breath and look at the incident as best we can, because it feels like emotions have got run pretty high, both amongst the fans and the people involved in the racing itself. So just to run over the kind of basic elements of the incident itself. So the entry to the corner, neither car is on the normal racing line, as far as I'm concerned. It doesn't look to me like either of them are really on what you consider the normal sort of standard racing line. And at the point at which both cars have to turn in, they are effectively side by side, because there is a point at which Hamilton's front wing is about in line with Verstappen's front wing. So they are essentially side by side at this point. And neither driver is going to want to yield. So both drivers have a responsibility for the risk involved in this kind of racing, especially when we consider the type of corner that we're talking about. Copse Corner, one of the fastest corners on the entire calendar. And I don't think the stewards are taking any part of the incident and isolating it as a point of contact as an example of fault. You know, they're looking at the whole thing in context up to the point where it was clear that Verstappen had lost control of the car and was going to crash. The consequences of the incident are kind of irrelevant. I should hope so, anyway, because that's not what penalties are about. Penalties are not about the result of the accident. It's about the actual accident or the incident itself. Now, Hamilton misses the apex, but Verstappen also turns in as if Hamilton has backed off, which maybe he thought that he had done or expected him to do, because that's probably a bit more of a Verstappen style thing to do. Verstappen has this kind of like, you're going to yield or we're going to have an accident. That's always been his quite aggressive style in racing. And on this occasion, Hamilton didn't do that. Hamilton went for it. He was, stuck with it and tried to keep going. And because of the speed and the type of corner, the result of this contact is pretty catastrophic. I think it's a bit clumsy from Hamilton in that he is going for it in an extremely risky situation, and because of the way the cars work and the aero, it's going to be very difficult for him to hold the line in the same way that he would if he was just by himself. There's definitely an element of blame for Hamilton here in that he's the one going for it. We talked before last time about the incident with Norris and Perez, and Perez is the one going for the move. He's the one taking a lot of the risk. He's taking the lion's share of the risk here. And I feel like that's a similar case for Hamilton here. So I think that the penalty is somewhat reasonable. I can see why they've given him a penalty for that. They explained the justification. I think that makes the penalty justified. Now, as for the severity of the penalty, that's where the kind of facts stop and the opinions start. So I will turn over to you now, and what's your perspective on this incident up until the point that we learn of the penalty?
I just want to say, listening to the way you described the incident was actually quite refreshing, because I've seen so much online of so many people so many journalists and so many people's opinions and whose fault it was and who did what and who caused what, and actually listening to you describe that incident, but by putting no fault on either driver, it's really refreshing, and hopefully, that comes out.
Well, I
on
did
the
say the
podcast.
lion's share of the blame was on Lewis to some extent.
True.
He's the one taking the most risk.
Yes, but you justified everything you said, which is so refreshing, because at the moment everyone's got an opinion online about this situation. Now, the incidents happened, and for one, I couldn't believe that Hamilton's car had as little damage as it did, given the severity of the impact. It was really quite surprising for me that Hamilton had a couple of minor chips or minor cracks in his front wing. And his tire
of his wheel as well, didn't he?
Yeah, and his tire was within operational was within that operational remit. And obviously, looking at Verstappen's car, that took quite a hefty impact. The penalty itself, firstly, obviously we had a yellow double wave yellow, then we had a safety car, then we had a red flag, which is great to see that the safety car was called out quite early. It was red flagged, and the safety of the driver was taken into utmost consideration at the British Grand Prix. Absolutely fantastic. And a massive thank you to the marshals as well, because they always do a fantastic job, and they made sure Max was okay, gave him the time, gave him the space he needed to get out of the vehicle, didn't force him out, gave him every helping hand he needed, which I thought was fantastic. And these guys, most of them, do it for free. They dedicate their whole weekends standing around in boiler suits in 30 degrees, orange boiler suits in 30 degrees to help maintain these events, which I think is fantastic. So the red flag was called out. All the cars came into the pits. I was really surprised that we didn't have a verdict on the penalty until racing had resumed. And because it was red flagged for probably 20, 25 minutes, would you say? Is that fair to say?
Yeah, about 20 minutes, something like that, yeah. I don't know exactly. That's how much it felt like anyway.
Yeah, it did feel like a long time. But I was very surprised and a bit upset that there wasn't a verdict of the penalty, which happened before the racing resumed. And then obviously a couple of laps into the restart, we had the verdict, and Lewis Hamilton had received a 10-second time penalty for causing a collision and obviously taking Max Verstappen out of the race. Yeah, you could probably tell, Alex, that I'm still quite on the fence of this one penalty-wise. He deserved a penalty without a doubt. Don't get me wrong. He absolutely deserved a penalty. And I'm a massive Lewis Hamilton supporter. He's a British racer, and I like to see him do well. In my eyes, if I'm being honest, and I'm keen to see your views on this, I think he deserved a slightly harsher penalty than a 10-second time penalty. Again, looking back into previous weeks where we've had minor contact between two cars, and that's resulted in 5-second time penalties. Something of this magnitude, I thought deserved a little bit more. What's your thoughts on the actual penalty itself?
I think I'm kind of leaning slightly the other way myself. I think that I could see why the penalty was given. I think it was the way that they justified it was reasonable. But if they'd called it a racing incident, I wouldn't have been surprised either. I think making the penalty harsher, I think that would be, I'm not sure how I would justify that, because you said the magnitude of the incident, but the actual consequences of the incident shouldn't, I would hope anyway, shouldn't come into it at all, because it's all about the actual incident itself. There are times when big accidents happen and there isn't really anybody at fault, so it's just a racing incident, even if it's a big, big crash. So I'm not sure how it could be justified as an even harsher penalty, and I don't think that there's some talk of the penalty should have been even harsher because Hamilton's in a Mercedes and he could easily make that time up. But we don't want the penalties to be based on who's driving the car or what car
Absolutely
they've got.
not. And I completely agree with that.
Because that's going to make things even more complicated. And also, it seems a little bit strange where you have the teams and the drivers working really hard, bringing everything they've got to get the best car and the best driver. And then they get told, well, if you're too good, you'll get penalised harsher, which just doesn't seem fair at all.
Yeah,
and just even more complicated. So I definitely wouldn't advocate that at all. Christian Horner, and we'll talk more about him a bit later, I'm sure. Christian Horner was talking about you should get a race ban. I mean, it's like, come on, mate, that's ridiculous. the safest thing, we're talking about this being dangerous. I mean, the safest thing for them not to do is not to get in the car. They all know that what they're doing is dangerous. It's motorsport. Even just going go-karting is dangerous. So it's a very, very difficult incident to call, and that's probably why it took them so much time. But the way that I tried to think about it was, what if it was two completely different cars? What if it was Latifi and Schumacher fighting for P17? How would I feel about it then? Probably feel much as the stewards have gone about it. Like, if they called it a racing incident, I wouldn't be surprised, but they could justify a time penalty. Now, and that's the way that it should be. It should apply the same way to all drivers and all cars. So I was thinking, if it was two like midfielders or two backmarkers that had exactly the same incident, how would I feel about it? And if the way that I feel about it then is different, then maybe that's the way that it should be.
Yeah.
So I'd like to think that if they had the same incident with different cars and different drivers, they would have called it the same way.
Do you think that was the right penalty to give, given the incident?
Again, if they called it a racing incident, I wouldn't be surprised. I think you could justify it either way. There is no kind of, it's very hard to say that there is an objective right answer here, because that's the nature of stewarding and refereeing in these kind of sports. Everyone's going to have a certain opinion on it. I think them calling it a 10-second time penalty is reasonable. I think that's a reasonable call. But if they'd not given him a penalty, then I would have been fine with that as well. But any harsher, I think is unfair, because you've got two brilliant drivers racing with everything they've got for the championship. They're entering a high-speed corner. They're almost alongside. Neither of them is going to yield. Contact is pretty much inevitable, and neither driver can be absolved of responsibility of that. There is no, it's completely this person's fault or completely that person's fault. And that's racing. If we don't have incidents and moments like that, and think of all the incidents that we have that are like that where they don't crash, that is racing. That is that is what makes racing exciting. If we start saying to drivers, "All stay apart, don't get close to each other, don't go too fast, don't do anything too risky," well, you might as well pack up and go home. There's no point racing if we're going to do that.
Yeah, very true. And I think, just to summarize this little segment, you made a very good point at the very beginning, is that neither driver had the racing line going into that corner. Yes, Max was on the outside of the track and had a better line, but it was by no means the racing line. The racing line is as far left in that corner, kissing the apex, and then carrying as much speed through as possible.
Swoop in, don't you?
Yeah, exactly. And so, 20 meters before that corner, both cars were touching, or not touching, but very close to the inside wall. So neither car was on the optimal racing line. So you could almost, we don't see overtakes like that happen very often going into that corner. So when it was being squared up, yes, if one driver had yielded, if it had been Max or it had been Lewis, we wouldn't have had that collision, but neither driver did, and neither driver should, because it's racing and they're prepared to take the risks they want to take. And yeah, what happened. And, like you said, the best outcome was that Max walked away unscathed and all his provisional checks came back absolutely clear, and he's free to race and continue training like normal. But wow, everyone's been wanting, or no one should really want a collision between two drivers, but we've all wanted this mammoth battle, but we all expected it to end in a collision. And given that we're 10 races into the season and we've had this almighty collision, which will probably be talked about and milked on Drive to Survive for a long time, potentially a whole episode. I'm sure they got some great
episode of just
Christian Horner
playing it back and slowing it down and playing radio messages from 25 years ago to make it seem like it's even more dramatic.
Amazing.
There's a brilliant parody waiting to happen, Rare. Somebody's got to do that.
Can't wait until March next year.
Yeah. The other thing to add on, and you touched on this, was the damage to Lewis's car. Now, he had a cracked wheel rim, I think. Now, if they hadn't had the red flag, they wouldn't have been able to replace that, because I think they had to replace it. Yeah. Which means if they hadn't had a red flag, Hamilton would have had to retire the car, most likely. Now, this all ties into something that I've mentioned before. I can't remember when we would have last talked about it, but which is the fact that they're allowed to work on the cars quite a bit during red flag conditions, which I kind of disagree with. It's a red flag, like the session stopped. I don't like that they're able to like get the cars back up to working shape again and go again. I'm not sure how I feel about that, but that's a whole different conversation. But certainly, yeah, if it weren't for the red flag, I think Lewis would have at least had to pit under the safety car and maybe even retire the car, which would have changed things completely. The red flag was necessary. I'm not questioning the red flag. Like, that barrier needed sorting out, and they didn't even move Verstappen's car for a long time. So a red flag was necessary. But the nature of the way that teams can work on cars means that totally changed the nature of that incident, in that Hamilton came out of it relatively unscathed. And so he was able to carry on with his race. And there was kind of nothing short of disqualifying Hamilton, which I certainly wouldn't advocate.
That was never going to happen.
There was nothing that they could do to kind of make it up to Red Bull. There was nothing that they could or were going to do to make it up to them, which made, Christian Horner et al. Understandably frustrated. But we'll talk more about that later, I'm sure.